I have always believed that a name carries more than letters. It carries your identity, the echo of who you are, the life you have lived up to this moment. My name is Naomi, and for as long as I can remember, I've fought to be seen, to be acknowledged, to belong, even when the people around me seemed determined to forget that I existed at all. I thought family was supposed to be a safe place, the people who cheer for you, protect you, and love you unconditionally. But sometimes, family can cut deeper than strangers ever could. It happened during what was meant to be a happy day, a celebration for my little half-brother and the baby he and my stepmom, Vanessa, were expecting. The house was buzzing with relatives, the scent of fresh flowers mingling with the aroma of baked goods, and laughter bouncing off the walls. I had spent hours helping with decorations, making sure every detail was perfect, because I wanted to contribute to the family, to show that I cared despite the constant tension. I was proud, even if part of me felt uneasy about Vanessa's behavior in the past. And then it happened. She looked right at me, smiling in that way that always made my skin crawl, and she said my name, but it wasn't mine. "Oh, Nina, come help me with the centerpiece," she laughed, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. My heart froze. The room didn't pause, didn't notice the slight, but I felt every eye, not just on me, but on the invisible line between what was polite and what was cruel. My blood roared in my ears, but I stayed still, because I had learned early that reacting in anger in front of family often makes you the villain in your own story. I wanted to shrink, to disappear into the wallpaper, to be anywhere but the center of her amusement. But I also felt something else, a simmering, quiet fire. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was indignation. It was the recognition that this had been happening for years, small jabs hidden in casual words, subtle ways of undermining me, of erasing me from the family narrative, and today it became impossible to ignore. I looked at Vanessa, her perfect posture, her mockery thinly veiled as humor, and I realized that she had no idea how far I had come, how much I had endured, and how much I was willing to reclaim. I wasn't just a name she could twist for laughs. I wasn't just a stepping stone in her curated family story. I was Naomi, a person who deserved respect, whose existence wasn't negotiable. As I stood there, feeling the heat of humiliation turn into resolve, I made a silent vow. Today, this would change. I would no longer let the laughter of someone who should have loved me dictate my self-worth. I would assert myself in the smallest or the loudest way necessary, and I would remind everyone, including Vanessa, that disrespect has consequences, even in a family setting. That day, the stakes were clear. My identity, my dignity, and my place in this family. If I failed to stand up for myself now, I would be invisible forever. But if I acted carefully and decisively, I could rewrite the rules. Have you ever been laughed at by someone who should have loved you? Have you felt the sting of someone erasing your identity with a word, a name, a joke? That moment, frozen in my memory, became the turning point. It was not just a name that was called wrong, it was every boundary I had allowed to be crossed, every slight I had swallowed, every ounce of patience I had given without recognition. And that day, I realized, patience only goes so far before it demands action. Subscribe now if you've ever been laughed at by someone who should have loved you, because what happened next changed everything. I remember the first day Vanessa came into our home. I was 12, a kid who had never asked for much beyond love and safety, and suddenly there was a new person moving into my life, smiling, laughing, and calling herself part of my family. I wanted to be polite. I wanted to be welcoming. I reminded myself that my father had chosen her, that she was supposed to make our family whole in some way I couldn't yet understand. The first few weeks were a blur of forced cheerfulness, of practicing my best manners, of trying to find common ground. I called her Vanessa when everyone else did, always careful to match the tone of voice she used for me. And then it started, the small missteps that felt accidental at first. She would call me Natalie instead of Naomi, or Nina, sometimes laughing as if it were a joke. I corrected her quietly, my cheeks burning, and she would shrug and say, "Oh, it's just a name, relax." But I couldn't relax. My name was me. It was my identity, my history, and having it twisted made a hollow pit open in my stomach. I tried to chalk it up to nervousness, to the awkwardness of merging families. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. I offered help in the kitchen, asked about her preferences for family dinners, complimented her attempts at cooking. I smiled when she looked my way and even laughed when she told a story, though the humor sometimes had a sharp edge I didn't understand at the time. Looking back, the first signs were subtle, almost invisible to anyone else. When she spoke to my father, she used a tone that was teasing, patronizing, sometimes dismissive of my input. When she spoke to my younger brother, she leaned over in ways that implied he needed instruction that I had never been asked to give. And with me, she would tilt her head, her lips curving in a polite smile that never reached her eyes, and call me by the wrong name just enough times to make me question whether I was imagining it. I remember one particular afternoon, helping with laundry, when she said, "Naomi, or is it Nina today?" in front of my father. He laughed lightly, as if it were charming, as if this moment didn't matter. I forced my smile, kept folding shirts, but inside, I felt the first flicker of something that would grow over the years, anger mixed with a determination not to be invisible. Every attempt I made to bond was met with thinly veiled mockery. I would ask about her hobbies, share stories about school or my friends, and she would nod politely, but there was a pause, a glance to someone else, a quiet smirk that made me feel small. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself that maybe I was overthinking, that perhaps I was just sensitive because I cared so much about keeping the peace. There were moments of kindness too, of course, brief flashes that made me believe we could coexist, even grow close. She would compliment something I did for the house or laugh at a joke I told, and I would breathe a sigh of relief. But those moments were fleeting, like sparks in a storm, easily extinguished by the subtle digs and misnaming that followed. I learned early to navigate the tension carefully, to smile even when my chest tightened, to laugh even when I wanted to cry. I would correct her silently when she called me the wrong name, remind myself that she didn't understand the history behind it, that she didn't know the hours I had spent helping my father, the meals I had skipped to save money, the nights I had lain awake worrying about my family. Yet, the cracks in respect were already forming, almost invisible, but unmistakable to me. I would see it in the way she looked at me across the dining table, in the way she dismissed my suggestions about family events, in the way my father sometimes ignored the subtle cruelty, choosing to laugh it off instead. Each moment accumulated, small stones in a pile that would one day feel impossible to move. Have you ever felt invisible in your own home? That strange sensation where you are present but unseen, where your contributions, your very name, seem negotiable? That's how it felt with Vanessa. I was polite, I was careful, I tried to understand, but deep down, I knew that some battles wouldn't be fought with smiles and laughter. Some battles demanded recognition, assertion, and eventually, confrontation. Even then, I promised myself that I would endure. I would not let these early moments of erasure define me or my place in my family. I would observe, learn, and wait for the right time to ensure that my voice, my identity, and my dignity could no longer be ignored. Those small slights, those subtle misnamings, planted a seed in me, a quiet, determined fire that one day would demand to be seen and respected. The first few times Vanessa called me by the wrong name, I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was a mistake, a slip of the tongue. But over time, it became clear that it wasn't accidental. It had become a pattern. "Nina," she would say, her voice light, almost sing-song, as if the misnaming were part of some private joke I wasn't in on. "Naomi, or is it Nina today?" she teased one evening at dinner, leaning back in her chair with that polished smirk that always left me unsettled. The family laughed politely. My father chuckled and shook his head. Even my younger brother glanced at me, uncertain whether to intervene or just join in. I remember sitting at the table, fork paused halfway to my mouth, the sudden tightness in my chest. I forced a smile, lowered my gaze to my plate, and pretended the joke didn't cut through me like a cold wind. Each misnaming was a reminder that Vanessa didn't see me for who I was. She didn't honor the name I had carried for years, the identity I had built within our family. And even more frustrating, the others seemed unconcerned. They saw humor where I felt humiliation. It wasn't just the names. There were the small jokes she made at my expense, subtle digs that others often laughed off. When I complimented a family recipe I had made for a gathering, she would smirk and say, "Oh, you mean the one Naomi, I mean Nina, tried to make," as if my effort were a spectacle rather than genuine care. Sometimes, she would imitate my voice or the way I spoke, all in front of guests, all while I swallowed the rising tide of embarrassment. I tried to respond politely at first. I corrected her gently. "It's Naomi," I would say, hoping she would acknowledge the slip and move on. But it rarely worked. Vanessa would shrug, smile faintly, and wave it off. "Oh, you know I'm just joking," she would say. And I wanted to believe her. I wanted to tell myself that humor was harmless, that family jest was a way to bond. But the laughter that followed was never mine to join. It belonged to them, the group that watched while my identity was twisted into a punchline. There were days when the simmering anger bubbled under the surface, barely controlled. I would catch her watching me with those calculating eyes, as if measuring my reaction to each misstep. Each slip of the wrong name was deliberate, I realized later, because the pattern was consistent, almost ritualistic. She was asserting something: control, superiority, or perhaps just the thrill of seeing me shrink in the background. I found myself replaying those moments in my mind, over and over. What should I have said? Should I have stood up, raised my voice, demanded respect? Or was silence the only way to survive without causing a scene? Each time Vanessa laughed, I questioned my own judgment. Was I being too sensitive? Was my pride clouding my perception? But deep down, I knew what I felt: hurt, invisibility, a violation of the very name that anchored me. Even family gatherings became exercises in endurance. When extended relatives or friends came over, Vanessa would continue her little games, twisting my name, joking at my expense, and the group would follow suit. Laughter filled the room, but I felt like I was outside it, a spectator to my own humiliation. I noticed the subtle glances exchanged between Vanessa and my father. Sometimes I thought he would step in, defend me, correct her, but it never happened. And that silence stung as much as her words. At school functions or community events where she would join us, the misnaming became a public performance. I would introduce myself to neighbors or friends, and she would immediately call me something else. I learned to brace myself, to smile politely, and to answer softly, correcting her quietly. But the pattern was relentless. There was no break, no moment where I could feel safe in my own name. There were times I almost laughed along with her, trying to diffuse the tension, hoping that by showing amusement, I could protect myself from the deepest sting of humiliation. But the laughter never felt real. It was a mask, a way to survive. And each time I forced a smile, I promised myself that I would not allow her games to define me, that I would find a way to assert myself without losing control. I noticed my patience being tested more than ever. A single misnaming could ruin the calm I worked so hard to maintain. I began to pay attention to the smallest cues. The way she emphasized certain syllables, the slight tilt of her head when she knew she had struck a nerve, the way her smile would tighten when she noticed my discomfort. It became a study in endurance, a game of subtle power, one I had no choice but to participate in. Despite all this, I continued to try to build some sort of bond. I asked about her day, shared stories from my life, complimented her achievements, all in the hope that eventually she would see me as an equal, as someone who belonged in her family as much as she did. But each attempt seemed to backfire. Her smiles remained faint, her laughter tinged with mockery, and the misnaming persisted. Have you ever corrected someone, only to have your correction dismissed as trivial? Or endured humiliation in silence to preserve peace? That was my reality. I had to navigate the tension delicately, to survive emotionally while maintaining the fragile semblance of family harmony. I knew deep down that each misstep she made was deliberate, yet I also understood that confrontation could escalate into chaos I wasn't prepared to handle. And so, I endured. I endured the repeated misnaming, the jokes at my expense, the laughter that wasn't mine to share. I endured the silent looks from family members who chose amusement over acknowledgement. Each day, I reminded myself that my dignity could not be taken unless I allowed it. I held on to the quiet determination that one day, these patterns of disrespect would be confronted, and my voice would finally be heard. I started noticing patterns that I couldn't ignore anymore. Vanessa had a way of inserting herself into every conversation, every plan, every moment that involved my family, and she did it with an ease that made it seem natural. But I saw through the veneer. I noticed how she tilted conversations to center herself, How she laughed at my father's jokes longer than anyone else's, how she nodded at my younger siblings in a way that subtly dismissed my presence. It wasn't blatant cruelty, it was far more insidious. She was carving out a sphere of influence, establishing control over the household, and I was on the outside. Family dinners became exercises in observation. I would sit quietly, trying to blend into the background, all the while watching Vanessa subtly shift attention, offering compliments to my siblings in a tone that made them feel indebted, praising my father in ways that seemed calculated, always positioning herself as indispensable. And then there was me. I had to keep my composure, maintain polite smiles, nod at the right moments, and never let my discomfort show. If I reacted, even slightly, she would beam as if I had lost my cool, and the others would laugh, sometimes out of habit, sometimes out of genuine amusement, and I would sink a little further into my chair. I tried to find coping mechanisms. I reminded myself that I had lived through far worse, that my dignity did not depend on her approval, and that I could choose which battles were worth fighting. I took care not to voice objections in public, to not correct her in front of the family, because I knew the moment would be twisted into another performance where I looked unreasonable. I learned to hold back, to retreat internally, even while my thoughts screamed for confrontation. There were mornings when I would wake up and replay interactions from the night before, dissecting every laugh, every glance, every offhand remark. Why did she look at me like that? Was that a subtle dig? Was she intentionally ignoring me in that conversation? Every subtle act felt magnified in my mind, every smirk burned into memory. I tried to rationalize, to find benign explanations. Maybe she was nervous, maybe she was just socializing in her way, maybe I was being too sensitive. But deep down, I knew the truth. She was asserting herself, and I was the one being edged out. Sometimes I caught her watching me, calculating, as if measuring how much she could push before I responded. It made me tense. I wanted to call her out, to demand respect, to reclaim the space I had every right to inhabit. But the fear of causing family conflict held me back. My father valued peace, even at the cost of fairness. My siblings were impressionable, and I didn't want to create divisions. I had to navigate the dynamics carefully, balancing my need for self-respect with the desire to maintain some semblance of harmony. Vanessa's favoritism was subtle but unmistakable. She offered small rewards, attention, and praise to those who aligned with her, and I saw how quickly my father and siblings responded. They didn't realize that these little gestures were manipulations, that she was building loyalty while eroding my presence. I could feel the weight of my invisibility at the table, in conversations, in shared plans. My contributions, years of support, emotional labor, family guidance, were taken for granted or overlooked entirely. I tried to assert myself quietly. I shared ideas, offered advice, contributed to family projects, but her responses were carefully crafted to undermine me. She would nod politely, then follow with a casual dismissal. "Oh, we'll see, Naomi, or is it Nina today? I get so confused sometimes." I forced a laugh, took a deep breath, and reminded myself that maintaining my composure was more important than scoring a point in a family tug-of-war. The internal tension grew heavier each day. Part of me wanted to confront her openly, to demand acknowledgement and respect, to make her understand that these subtle digs were unacceptable. Another part of me feared the fallout, the arguments, the tension, the possibility of being labeled the difficult one, the one who disrupted the peace. It was a constant push and pull. I found myself thinking in circles, weighing the cost of speaking up versus the cost of silence. I also noticed how she manipulated my father. She framed herself as helpful, considerate, and supportive, often presenting my suggestions as unnecessary or overbearing. He, eager to avoid conflict, would nod, agreeing with her assessments, unaware or perhaps unwilling to see how her actions affected me. The realization stung, that my own father, the person who had always been my anchor, could be swayed so easily by her charm and subtle manipulations. Despite all of this, I did my best to maintain distance without disengaging entirely. I offered help when needed, participated in family events, and stayed polite, careful not to give her ammunition. I observed every word, every gesture, every nuance, cataloging the way she navigated our family dynamics, trying to anticipate her next move. I became hyper-aware, always calculating, always bracing for the next subtle humiliation. At night, I would replay interactions, feeling the tension settle into my chest like a heavy weight. I imagined the confrontation I longed to have, rehearsed my words, envisioned the reclaiming of my voice. Yet morning came, and I would return to the same delicate dance, polite smiles, measured responses, and a constant vigilance. I began to wonder how long I could endure this, how long I would wait before confronting the disrespect. Was there a threshold, a point where silence became complicity? Or would I continue to internalize, to protect myself, to preserve family harmony at the expense of my own dignity? I didn't have the answers yet. All I knew was that the pattern was clear, the manipulation intentional, and my patience, already stretched thin, was being tested every day. And so, I continued to observe, to endure, to measure, to wait, holding my ground silently, keeping my voice in check, while silently plotting the moment when I could assert myself without destroying the fragile bonds I still cared about. I remember the day like it was etched in my memory with sharp, unrelenting clarity. The morning sunlight filtered through the windows, bouncing off the walls of my parents' living room, where the family had gathered in cheerful anticipation. Vanessa had been unusually quiet during breakfast, a mysterious glint in her eyes that immediately set my nerves on edge. Then, as if on cue, she stood in the center of the room, placed her hands delicately over her growing belly, and announced, "I'm pregnant." The room erupted with joy. My father clapped, my siblings squealed in excitement, and even distant relatives who had come for a casual visit shared hugs and congratulations. Everyone's attention gravitated toward her, and I found myself clapping along mechanically, smiling with what I hoped was grace. Inside, however, a storm brewed. I had spent years quietly contributing to the family, guiding my siblings, helping with household matters, and maintaining balance in ways that often went unnoticed. And yet, in this moment, I felt invisible, sidelined, reduced to a background observer of the excitement surrounding Vanessa. As the congratulations flowed, she didn't look at me once. When she did glance in my direction, it wasn't acknowledgement, it was a forced smile, distant and fleeting, a subtle reminder that she held the stage, and I was merely part of the scenery. My stomach knotted. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to focus on the joy of new life, on celebrating what should have been a happy occasion. I told myself that any resentment would have to wait, that composure was my weapon, and dignity my shield. But the insults came quickly, wrapped in a veil of humor. She leaned over to my father, whispering something meant to be inaudible, and yet it carried. Then, she called me the wrong name, laughing lightly in front of everyone. "Oh, Naomi, I mean, Nina. You're always so quiet," she said, her eyes sparkling with that practiced charm that made the misnaming feel almost like a joke. The room tittered with laughter, some gentle, some unthinking, and I could feel the heat rising to my cheeks. I smiled. I laughed too, mechanically, keeping my voice low, keeping my face calm. I told myself that my dignity wasn't dependent on recognition from someone who seemed determined to chip away at it. Yet, every fiber of me ached at the injustice. It wasn't just the misnaming, it was the persistent message that I didn't matter, that my presence could be twisted into amusement while Vanessa claimed the spotlight. Throughout the day, I observed the interactions carefully, cataloging every small slight. She positioned herself at the center of photographs, subtly elbowing others aside. When people approached me to offer congratulations, she leaned in, redirecting attention to herself, narrating stories in which she was the heroine and I was a background figure. I caught snippets of conversations where she recounted family history inaccurately, conveniently omitting my contributions or reframing them as minor or unremarkable. I tried to stay composed. I told myself that my voice, my worth, and my dignity did not rely on acknowledgement from someone who thrived on mischief and subtle control. I reminded myself that the pregnancy was a milestone, that the family was celebrating new life, and that I could participate without compromising my inner strength. But the more I held back, the more I felt the simmering frustration build. Every laugh that followed her misnaming, every glance that ignored my presence, was like a tiny strike against my patience. My mind wandered to all the moments leading up to this day, the quiet support I had given, the countless hours I spent maintaining peace in the household, the efforts I had poured into family events and holidays. All of it seemed invisible now, overshadowed by her ability to command attention with charm and selective affection. I thought about speaking up, correcting her in front of the family, asserting my presence and my contributions. But the risk was high. Confrontation could trigger arguments, cast me as the disruptor, and deepen the chasm she was slowly widening. Still, the need to protect my dignity persisted. I remembered every time she had subtly undermined me, every joke at my expense, every glance that made me feel like an outsider in my own family. And I realized that silence, while safer in the short term, allowed the pattern to continue unchecked. I made a mental note. I would find the right moment, the right way, to reclaim my voice and ensure that my presence and my worth were undeniable. That evening, after the celebrations wound down and the guests began to leave, I retreated to a quiet corner of the house. I let the weight of the day settle over me, thinking of all the ways she had tried to diminish me, all the ways my family seemed to accept it without question. I reflected on my options, on whether I could continue enduring this with polite restraint, or whether it was time to stand firm, even if it meant rocking the boat. The tension inside me was like a tight coil, ready to spring. I realized that the pregnancy announcement was more than just a joyful occasion, it was a moment of revelation. Vanessa's behavior wasn't random. It was calculated, deliberate, and persistent. And I could no longer ignore the pattern. I could not allow my presence to be erased, my dignity compromised, or my voice silenced any longer. As I lay awake that night, replaying every interaction, every misnamed remark, every smirk that accompanied her words, I made a silent vow to myself. I would not be invisible. I would find a way to assert my presence, to demand respect, and to ensure that anyone who tried to belittle me would understand the consequences. I thought that by helping organize Vanessa's baby shower, I could finally bridge the widening gap between us. I wanted this to be a celebration of new life, a moment for the family to gather and share joy. I told myself repeatedly that my intentions were pure, that my support came from a place of love, not obligation or expectation of praise. Still, I couldn't shake the underlying tension that had settled between us like an unwelcome guest. From the very beginning, I threw myself into planning. I coordinated with vendors, ordered decorations, and tracked RSVPs with the meticulousness of someone who knew every detail mattered. I spent long nights comparing tablecloths, flower arrangements, and gift bags, making sure that every piece fits seamlessly into the vision I had for a warm, welcoming celebration. I even set aside a portion of my own savings to cover things Vanessa either overlooked or dismissed as unimportant. Every penny, every hour, every little effort was a silent testament to the care I had for my family. And yet, even as I poured myself into the preparations, the small slights continued. Vanessa would call me by the wrong name in passing, laugh lightly, and brush off my suggestions with a casual wave of her hand. "Oh, Naomi, you worry too much. This is going to be fine," she said on more than one occasion, dismissing hours of planning as trivial. The laughter that followed from the room around us stung like acid. My contributions, no matter how thoughtful or substantial, were treated as optional, almost irrelevant, as though my presence in this pivotal moment could be mocked without consequence. At first, I tried to let it slide. I reminded myself that perhaps she was nervous, overwhelmed by the upcoming birth, or simply unaccustomed to someone taking the lead in such matters. I told myself that the point wasn't to be recognized, it was to ensure the shower was beautiful, that it reflected the joy of a new life about to enter our family. But the repeated dismissals, the subtle jokes, and the way she minimized my role began to gnaw at my patience. I felt my heart tighten every time someone laughed at a quip she made at my expense, every time a vendor complimented her for choices I had suggested, and every time my careful work was reframed as unnecessary. There were moments when I questioned my own resolve. Was I overreacting? Was I imagining malice where there was none? I spent long evenings replaying each interaction in my mind, searching for a way to justify her behavior, to convince myself that my hurt was unfounded. But deep down, I knew better. The pattern was unmistakable, and the disrespect was deliberate. Still, I held on to the desire to support my family. I reminded myself of the years I had dedicated to helping my son, the countless sacrifices I had made to ensure he had stability and happiness. I thought of the love I had poured into this household, and I refused to let bitterness overshadow that. I wanted to be a part of the joy, even if my role was minimized, even if my contributions went unacknowledged. As the days progressed and the shower approached, I noticed Vanessa growing bolder. She would call me by the wrong name in front of vendors and relatives alike, as though testing my patience and my limits. Each time, I forced a polite smile, maintaining composure while internally simmering with frustration. I carefully catalogued each slight in my mind, storing them not as fuel for retaliation yet, but as a record of the disregard I endured. The planning itself became a balancing act. On one hand, I wanted to ensure that the shower reflected the excitement and love we should all feel for a new life. On the other hand, I had to guard my own dignity, deciding when to speak and when to let comments slide. It was exhausting, navigating the line between involvement and avoidance, and by the end of each day, I often collapsed into bed with a heavy mixture of fatigue and suppressed anger. There were small victories, though, moments when I caught Vanessa genuinely smiling at the decor I had chosen or a table setting that perfectly matched the theme. In those fleeting instances, I allowed myself a whisper of satisfaction, a reminder that my efforts were not entirely invisible. But even then, the joy was tinged with the knowledge that recognition was fleeting and that the next slight could erase any sense of accomplishment. Through it all, I wrestled with the question: should I allow myself to be invisible for the sake of harmony, or should I assert my presence, even at the risk of conflict? Each choice seemed weighted with consequence. Remaining silent protected me from immediate confrontation but allowed the pattern of disrespect to continue. Speaking up could assert my dignity but potentially disrupt the fragile peace of family interactions. In quiet moments, I thought about what the baby shower symbolized. It wasn't just a celebration of life, it was a test of family dynamics, of respect, and of how far I was willing to go to maintain my integrity. I realized that supporting life and maintaining self-respect were not mutually exclusive, though balancing them required careful thought and patience. And so, I continued. I kept my composure, continued my meticulous planning, and held back the rising tide of anger and frustration. I reminded myself of the bigger picture, the importance of family, and the joy that should surround the arrival of a new child. I promised myself that I would find a moment to reclaim my voice, to ensure that my presence and my contributions were finally acknowledged, and that the respect I deserved would be recognized. The baby shower was looming, and I knew that every interaction leading up to it mattered. Every slight, every misnamed remark, every dismissive laugh was building toward something. I could feel it simmering beneath the surface, a reckoning that was both inevitable and necessary. I wasn't sure yet what form it would take, but I understood this much. The time for silent endurance was coming to an end, and the moment to assert my dignity was approaching. Could I continue to give, to organize, and to support while maintaining my self-respect? Could I navigate this minefield of passive aggression without losing myself? These were questions I asked myself nightly as I reviewed each detail, each interaction, and each subtle jab. The answers were forming in the quiet corners of my mind, building toward the inevitable confrontation that would define the true balance of respect in my family. I had reached the edge of my patience long before that day, but nothing prepared me for the final insult. The room was buzzing with laughter, chatter, and the faint scent of floral arrangements. Friends and family milled about, glasses clinking, the atmosphere thick with excitement. I had spent countless hours ensuring every detail of Vanessa's baby shower was perfect, the seating, the decorations, the favors, and yet, as soon as she arrived, the tension I had felt for months crystallized into something undeniable. It happened during the opening toast. Vanessa stood tall, smiling for the crowd, and as she began acknowledging everyone who had helped, she glanced at me and said, with a teasing lilt, "And of course, a special thanks to Nadia for helping organize everything." I froze. My heart lurched in my chest, a mix of disbelief and rage flooding through me. Nadia? My name is Naomi. Not Nadia, not Nadine, not anything else, Naomi. But the laugh that followed, half from Vanessa and half from the room, made it clear, this was deliberate. My contributions, my presence, my identity, all dismissed with a single misnamed word and a cruel chuckle. I felt my face burn, a tightness spreading from my chest to my throat. The humiliation was suffocating. Every small slight, every whispered jab over the past months, every casual dismissal replayed in my mind like a montage of disrespect. I had tolerated so much for the sake of peace, for the sake of family, for the sake of love. And yet here it was, the culmination of months of mockery, delivered publicly for all to see. I wanted to speak. I wanted to shout, to demand recognition, to make her see what her words did to me. But I held my tongue at first, clenching my fists beneath the table, breathing in shallow bursts, counting to 10, counting to 50, trying to reclaim some semblance of control. My mind raced with all the things I wanted to say, all the ways I could assert my dignity in that moment. But the room was watching. Every eye that flicked toward me seemed to take delight in the exchange, assuming I would laugh it off or scurry away like I had before. And yet, I refused to laugh. I refused to disappear as she had implied, even silently, for months. The anger that had simmered quietly within me boiled over, a tidal wave that demanded release. I could feel my heartbeat in my temples, my jaw tight, my stomach twisting with the betrayal I had endured. Every ounce of restraint I had maintained over the past weeks, over the years, even, suddenly felt fragile, stretched thin to the breaking point. The room fell silent as I finally spoke, my voice measured but strong. "Vanessa," I began, every syllable deliberate, "my name is Naomi. I have spent countless hours ensuring this day would be perfect, not for myself, but for this family. I deserve to be called by the name that is mine." For a moment, the silence stretched uncomfortably. Some guests shifted in their seats, glancing nervously between us. Vanessa's confident smile faltered ever so slightly, and I could see, just for a fleeting second, the recognition of the wrong she had done. But she quickly masked it, lifting her chin and attempting a dismissive laugh. "Oh, Naomi, you're so serious," she said, clearly intending to minimize me, to brush off my assertion as an overreaction. That moment, the laughter, the misnaming, the dismissal, ignited something I could no longer contain. I was not going to allow my identity, my contributions, my respect, to be erased in front of everyone. The betrayal cut deeper than words could describe. Every late night I spent organizing, every penny I had sacrificed, every ounce of energy poured into this event suddenly screamed in my mind, "I deserve better." I looked around at the faces of those who had watched silently, who had laughed along or pretended not to notice. I realized, with an almost painful clarity, that silence and politeness were no longer options. If I continued to let this go unchecked, it would signal that my dignity was negotiable, that my identity was optional. I had reached the point where being polite meant betraying myself. And so I stood. I straightened my back, lifted my chin, and spoke louder this time, with a certainty that seemed to echo across the room. "Everyone here can see what I have contributed, even if some prefer to ignore it. I will not allow my name, my presence, or my work to be diminished. Naomi is who I am, and I will not vanish for anyone's amusement." Gasps and murmurs spread through the crowd. Some relatives looked uncomfortable, unsure how to react, while a few friends exchanged wide-eyed glances. Vanessa's face, pale now, registered a shock I had never seen before. She stumbled over her words, attempting some feeble correction, some attempt at damage control, but the moment had passed. The power had shifted, not through aggression, but through assertion of self-worth. Even in the face of humiliation, I realized that standing up for myself was not only necessary, it was liberating. The fear that had held me back, the fear of conflict, of family tension, of being labeled difficult, evaporated, leaving only a clear understanding. I was entitled to respect, and I would no longer allow anyone to undermine me, not in front of family, not behind closed doors. That night, as I lay in bed replaying the confrontation, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. My anger had not subsided entirely, but it had transformed into clarity. I understood that this was a turning point, a moment where I reclaimed not only my name, but my dignity. I had endured long enough, and now, finally, I had drawn a line that could not be crossed. If someone publicly disrespected you, how would you respond? Would you let it pass, swallow the humiliation, and smile? Or would you stand, voice strong and unwavering, and assert the respect that is your right? In that moment, I discovered the power of refusal, the power of holding firm when others try to erase you. And I knew, without a doubt, that the next steps I took would no longer be in silence. After the breaking point, I knew I couldn't let the humiliation slide without a response, but I also knew I wanted it to be measured, meaningful, not petty. I spent the night thinking, replaying every laugh, every dismissive comment, every time Vanessa had misnamed me in front of others. My anger was still hot, but I wanted my reaction to reflect not just my hurt, but the dignity I refused to lose. The next morning, I woke early, careful not to wake anyone else. My mind was buzzing with possibilities. I didn't want to ruin the shower. It wasn't about revenge in the destructive sense. I wanted to assert respect, to leave a message that couldn't be ignored. I wanted her to feel the weight of her words and actions without creating a scene that would make me seem spiteful. I started by walking through the rooms where the decorations had been set up. Tables lined with gifts, floral arrangements, personalized favors, all carefully crafted with love and attention. I imagined the faces of the guests, the smiles and laughter, and realized that the best way to reclaim my dignity was not by shouting or confronting in public again, but by subtly inserting reminders of my presence, my contributions, and my voice. I took the flower arrangements in my hands, examining the cards attached to each bouquet. On the front, the printed notes were cheerful and celebratory, but I had slipped in small handwritten messages, ones only noticed if someone paid close attention. Simple words like respect is earned and remembered, names carry weight, do not forget, and the hands that care deserve acknowledgement. They weren't mean, they weren't confrontational, but the undertone was undeniable. Next, I turned to the favors. Little boxes filled with sweets and keepsakes sat neatly on each table. I had purchased and wrapped them myself over the past weeks, ensuring each detail was perfect. Now, I carefully inserted a small note in each, a reminder of my care and effort. Nothing aggressive, nothing accusatory, just reminders that my presence had mattered, that my work had not gone unnoticed. Every guest who opened a favor and read the message would encounter a silent assertion of respect. Packing symbolic messages into arrangements was emotional work. Each note, each careful placement, was a reminder of all the years I had invested in this family, in preparing for this moment, in enduring the small daily slights that had accumulated into a storm of humiliation. My hands trembled at times, and my chest felt tight, the combination of anger, anticipation, and moral hesitation making each movement heavy. Could I really do this? Was I crossing a line into passive aggression? Or was this simply reclaiming my dignity in a way that spoke louder than confrontation ever could? I paused, standing in the middle of the living room, taking a deep breath. The room was transformed from a chaotic prep space into a carefully orchestrated tableau of care, effort, and subtle reminders. I thought about Vanessa, about the smirk she had worn, about the way she had laughed at my name. I imagined her walking through the room, noticing the little details, feeling the quiet impact of my words woven into every corner of the celebration. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile. This was not cruelty, it was not vindictive. It was a declaration that I existed, that my contributions mattered, and that respect was not optional. The excitement and nervousness swirled inside me, the kind that comes with anticipating how someone will react when the subtle weight of their actions is mirrored back at them. I wanted to see her pause, to see her confronted with the truth of her own behavior, and yet I also wanted to maintain my moral compass, to know that my response was grounded in dignity, not spite. Then I moved to the final touch, the seating chart. I had worked tirelessly to ensure that everyone felt welcome, that families were accommodated, that friends and relatives had spaces that encouraged conversation and laughter. I made small, intentional adjustments. Some seats held subtle tokens of my work, a small card indicating that I had personally handled the arrangements, a tiny flourish that could not be mistaken for oversight or coincidence. It was subtle, nearly invisible unless someone looked closely, but to those who understood, it was unmistakable, a quiet testament to my role, my effort, and my worth. By the time I finished, I felt a mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. My heart was still heavy with the memory of the public misnaming, but now it was tempered with a sense of purpose. I had transformed my anger into strategy, my hurt into a methodical assertion of self-respect. I had not shouted, I had not humiliated, and yet the message would reach those who mattered, especially Vanessa. I stepped back and surveyed the room, taking in the careful lines of decorations, the carefully placed reminders, the small but deliberate symbols of my effort. My hands were sore from the hours of work, my body fatigued, but there was a lightness in my chest. I had done something that no one could take away from me. I had claimed my dignity and made it impossible for anyone to erase me without seeing it reflected back at them. As I left the room to prepare myself for the arrival of guests, I felt a strange thrill. The tension was almost unbearable. The anticipation of seeing how Vanessa would react, the moral hesitation mingling with the certainty that I had acted correctly. I was nervous, yes, but in that nervousness there was also power. The power of a woman who refused to be diminished, who refused to allow disrespect to pass without recognition, who had turned humiliation into a quiet, undeniable statement of worth. Could you walk away from anger and instead craft a response that speaks louder than confrontation? Could you assert your value without stooping to cruelty? That morning, I learned the answer for myself. It was possible. It was necessary. And it was the first step in reclaiming not just my authority in the household, but my peace of mind. The morning of the baby shower arrived with a strange mix of excitement and apprehension. The house smelled of fresh flowers and baked goods, each corner meticulously arranged, each detail painstakingly perfected. I had spent hours, no, days, preparing for this moment, not merely as a celebration, but as a stage for my quiet assertion of dignity. Vanessa, of course, expected admiration. She expected compliments, smiles, and laughter that revolved around her. She never suspected that the focus might subtly, imperceptibly, shift in a way that reflected not just her pregnancy, but my presence, my effort, and the respect I demanded. As guests began to arrive, I moved through the room with calm precision, ensuring everything was exactly as it should be. I watched their eyes wander over the decorations, the carefully curated tables, and then inevitably, to the small handwritten notes I had slipped into the favors and arrangements. Some smiled softly, others looked curious, picking up the subtle messages and turning them over in their hands. I could feel the shift in the room, the invisible energy of recognition circulating around me. Vanessa arrived shortly after the first guests had settled, radiant in a way she always thought would command attention. She expected to be the center of every eye, to receive nothing but praise. At first, she floated through the crowd, smiling and accepting congratulations. But I could see it, the tiny flicker of discomfort when someone leaned over to read one of the notes I had tucked into a favor, when a guest paused to admire a table centerpiece and remarked on the care it must have taken to create it. The compliments, while polite, carried a subtle undercurrent that reminded her she was not the only one who had contributed, and more importantly, she was not the one dictating respect. I moved from room to room, offering gentle guidance, making small suggestions that highlighted the effort I had invested. Each guest I spoke to caught a glimpse of the meticulous planning, of the energy I had poured into this day. I noticed Vanessa's smiles faltering slightly when she realized that my hand was behind so much of what they were admiring. She tried to maintain her composure, to offer her usual charm, but the tension was beginning to build, threading through her otherwise practiced grace. As the shower progressed, Vanessa became increasingly aware that the narrative was shifting. Guests who had initially been focused solely on her pregnancy now mentioned the little details that I had orchestrated. A friend praised the personalized favors, noting the thoughtfulness and precision. Another complimented the arrangement of the flowers, a detail Vanessa had dismissed as trivial in the past. I could see her eyes dart toward me, a flicker of realization, and perhaps panic, crossing her face. The misnaming, the subtle slights that had been casually tolerated for months, now seemed to hover in the air, unspoken yet undeniable. Guests exchanged glances, and I noticed the quiet recognition in their eyes, as if they suddenly understood the undercurrent of my years of effort, of the respect that had been withheld from me. Vanessa's smile tightened, no longer warm, as she began to grasp that her behavior had consequences beyond mere words. I stayed composed, moving with deliberate calm, ensuring the flow of the shower remained smooth, that laughter and conversation continued uninterrupted. I did not call attention to her mistakes, I did not make a scene. My lesson was not delivered through confrontation, but through the undeniable presence of my labor, my thoughtfulness, and my quiet insistence on being seen and respected. At one point, Vanessa approached me, attempting her usual charm, but there was a subtle hesitation in her tone. "Naomi, everything looks beautiful," she said, the words clipped. I nodded, offering a small smile, careful not to betray the satisfaction I felt. I allowed her to sense, without words, that I had orchestrated much more than she realized. That my contributions were foundational, not auxiliary, and that her disregard, her misnaming, her laughter at my expense, had not gone unnoticed. The tension rose with each passing moment, a quiet crescendo that did not require shouting or embarrassment. I watched as she navigated the room, realizing that the admiration she expected was being shared, redistributed, in a way that subtly highlighted her oversights. I could see the flicker of embarrassment in her eyes, the discomfort that comes when someone finally recognizes the impact of their behavior. Through it all, I felt a mix of exhilaration and calm. My nervousness from the previous day had transformed into a confident, measured satisfaction. I had achieved my goal without resorting to spectacle. I had taught a lesson, not through anger, but through visibility, acknowledgement, and subtle assertion. Every guest who noticed the details I had woven into the event became an unwitting participant in a quiet reckoning. By the end of the shower, I could sense the shift fully. Vanessa's energy had changed. The confidence she had exuded upon arrival was tempered by a new awareness. She knew she had been seen, that her behavior had consequences, and that my presence, my contributions, and my insistence on respect could not be erased or ignored. I had not humiliated her, I had not raised my voice, yet the lesson had landed. As I stood back, watching her navigate her own realization, I felt an unexpected release. Years of hurt, of misnaming, of subtle disrespect, began to dissolve into a quiet satisfaction. I had claimed my space, affirmed my dignity, and ensured that my voice, my identity, was acknowledged, even in a room meant to celebrate someone else. Would you confront disrespect publicly, creating a scene, or quietly teach a lesson through your presence and actions? That morning, I learned that subtlety can be more powerful than anger, and dignity more satisfying than vengeance. I had created a moment that would linger, not in humiliation, but in awareness, and in the respect that had long been denied. The room had quieted, the soft chatter of guests replaced by a tension that seemed to vibrate in the air. Vanessa, who had been flitting between conversations and laughter earlier, now seemed unmoored. I could see it in her eyes, the first hint of something raw and unguarded. Her confident facade was cracking, revealing the vulnerability she had always tried to hide behind sarcasm and small jabs at my expense. It began with a sharp intake of breath, almost a shudder, as if she had suddenly realized how the day had unfolded. Her hands trembled slightly, clutching a glass of punch she no longer seemed to notice. Then, without warning, the tears came. Big, wet, uncontrolled. I watched her cry, the sound echoing against the walls, mingling with her shallow sobs. For a moment, I felt a pang of something. Was it pity? Perhaps a trace of empathy, but it was quickly replaced by a steadier emotion. Quiet vindication. Vanessa's tears were accompanied by words, sharp, angry, defensive words. "Naomi, this isn't fair. You think you can just..." Her voice cracked mid-sentence, the fury and fear interlacing. She gestured wildly toward the centerpieces, the favors, the arrangements, all the subtle reminders I had orchestrated to assert my presence and demand respect. You've made me look ridiculous." I remained still, calm, grounded in a steadiness I hadn't felt in years. I had anticipated confrontation, yes, but I had not anticipated her unraveling in front of everyone, the impact of my quiet, methodical approach. I could feel the eyes of our family and friends on us, sensing the weight of what had been simmering beneath polite smiles for months, maybe years. But I did not flinch. I did not yell. I did not defend myself with anger. Instead, I allowed the moment to speak for itself. Vanessa continued, her voice wavering between tears and rage. "All these years, all this effort you've made, and now you have to humiliate me in front of everyone." She shook her head, her hands lifting toward the ceiling as if to shake the room itself. "You can't just, this isn't how family works." I let her words hang, heavy and raw, before responding. My voice was measured, calm, almost gentle. "Vanessa, I haven't humiliated you. I've simply made visible what's always been true. I've always contributed, I've always cared, and I've always been here, even when my presence was minimized or dismissed. Today, these arrangements reflect my effort, my dedication, and yes, my expectation to be treated with respect. Her eyes widened. The initial shock of being named, of being confronted with her own behavior, registering slowly. She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again, but the words faltered. The tears kept falling, but there was now a mixture of realization, disbelief, and the first slivers of accountability. I took a slow breath, allowing the room to absorb my calmness. I wanted her to understand that dignity does not come from confrontation alone. It comes from holding your ground, from making sure that respect is not given casually or taken lightly. I had suffered the misnaming, the casual jokes, the exclusion, the laughter at my expense, for months, and I had endured it quietly. Now, without raising my voice, without shouting, I was finally reclaiming that respect. Vanessa's reaction oscillated between lashing out and breaking down. I didn't mean it. I didn't. I thought. Her voice was fragmented, uneven, almost childlike in its honesty. I noticed, for the first time, that she was no longer the confident, polished woman I had tried to tolerate and appease. She was human, vulnerable, flawed, and perhaps, finally aware of the hurt she had caused. I allowed a moment of silence, letting the gravity of years of disrespect settle over her. "Vanessa," I said softly, "I've never expected perfection from anyone. I've never demanded your gratitude for being part of this family. But I do expect recognition of my presence, acknowledgement of my contributions, and respect. That is not too much to ask." Her face crumpled further, the realization fully sinking in. The room felt heavy with unspoken apologies, the kind that are understood without ever needing to be voiced aloud. Guests shifted, some nodding subtly, others offering sympathetic glances, recognizing the tension, the history, and the quiet power of my assertion. As she continued to cry, I reflected on the years of misnaming, the jokes, the passive dismissals, the times I had swallowed my pride for the sake of family harmony. Each slight, once invisible to others, now weighed heavily on her conscience. I realized that my dignity, long denied, was finally being mirrored back in her discomfort. I had restored a piece of my self-worth without shouting, without confrontation, simply by standing firmly in my own presence. The confrontation, though quiet, had its effect. Vanessa's cries softened, her outburst mellowed into whispered apologies that she didn't fully know how to express. I nodded, not because I needed her forgiveness, but because I had fulfilled my own need, to assert myself, to reclaim my voice, and to ensure that I would no longer be diminished in my own home. I left the room briefly, walking into the garden to catch my breath, feeling a surge of clarity and calm. The sun hit my face, the air smelled of fresh blooms from the decorations I had arranged, and for the first time in a long while, I felt free. The weight of carrying disrespect, of being minimized, was finally lifted, replaced with quiet, resolute strength. When I returned, Vanessa had composed herself somewhat, though the tears still lingered in her eyes. She avoided meeting mine directly, perhaps unsure how to reconcile her emotions with my unwavering calm. I offered her a small, gentle smile, a subtle acknowledgement that this moment was not about humiliation, it was about restoration, about boundaries, and about respect earned and observed. By the end of the day, the emotional crescendo had passed. Guests mingled, conversations resumed, and the atmosphere slowly lightened, but the lesson remained, imprinted quietly in everyone's awareness. Vanessa's reaction, though dramatic, had not shaken me. It reminded me that years of silent endurance, careful observation, and strategic action could culminate in a moment of clarity and assertion that no one could diminish. Would I have preferred she recognized me sooner? Yes. Would I have wished for a gentler path to respect? Perhaps. But in the end, standing firm, remaining calm, and allowing her to confront the impact of her behavior herself was more powerful than any confrontation could have been. Looking back on everything, I realize how much strength it took to endure years of small humiliations, of being called the wrong name, of feeling invisible in my own home. Every laugh, every careless misnaming, every whispered joke at my expense had stacked up like bricks, slowly building a wall between who I was and how the family treated me. At the time, I thought patience would be enough, that my quiet endurance and consistent kindness would eventually earn respect. I was wrong. Respect is not given to those who wait silently, It is claimed, often in moments that demand courage and clarity. I think about the earliest memories I have of Vanessa stepping into our lives, and how I tried, in my own polite way, to welcome her. I remember holding back my true feelings when she twisted my name, when she laughed at me in front of others, and when she minimized my contributions. I told myself it was for peace, for the sake of the family, for the sake of not rocking the boat. Every time I swallowed my pride, I hoped for a small gesture of acknowledgement, a word of thanks, a sign that my presence mattered. Those signs rarely came. As I reflect, I see the pattern clearly now. It was never about me being wrong, or overreacting, or being sensitive. It was about boundaries that were never respected, about a person who chose humor over humanity, mockery over acknowledgement, and ego over empathy. Each incident, seemingly small on its own, compounded into years of subtle, simmering pain. And yet, I endured, believing that love, patience, and dedication could bridge a gap where respect had failed. The baby shower, the carefully planned moments, the symbolic messages, all of it became my turning point. It was there, in a room filled with friends and family, that I transformed years of quiet endurance into visible, undeniable truth. I didn't shout. I didn't yell. I didn't humiliate anyone in the way I had been treated. I simply allowed my efforts, my planning, and my presence to make a statement louder than any words could. Watching Vanessa confront her own actions, seeing the surprise, the discomfort, the tears, I understood the power of quiet assertion. Respect, when earned through dignity and patience, carries weight that mockery cannot outweigh. I also realized that my strength was not about revenge or proving her wrong. It was about reclaiming my voice, my identity, and my self-worth. For years, I had allowed her laughter, her misnaming, and her dismissive comments to diminish me in ways that no one else noticed. But on that day, I was no longer invisible. I was no longer a punchline or an afterthought. I had reclaimed the narrative, reshaped the reality of our interactions, and established a standard for how I deserved to be treated. Family dynamics are complex. Love does not always equal respect. Patience does not always result in acknowledgement. And yet, standing firm, even when it feels uncomfortable or confrontational, is sometimes the only way to assert the truth. I learned that boundaries are not just about protecting yourself, they are about defining who you are in the eyes of those who might otherwise forget. I learned that dignity is not fragile. It grows stronger each time it is claimed after being denied. I think about how different things might have been if I had spoken up sooner, if I had refused to tolerate the casual mockery from the start. But I also understand that every experience, every slight, every overlooked effort, contributed to the moment when I could finally act with complete clarity and purpose. My patience, my endurance, and my careful planning culminated in a lesson that could not be ignored. I also reflect on forgiveness. Forgiveness is a choice, but it is not always immediate, and it is certainly not obligatory. I learned that asserting respect and setting boundaries can coexist with empathy, but they do not require erasing the impact of years of mistreatment. I chose not to humiliate Vanessa beyond what she had invited through her behavior. I chose to teach a lesson through visibility, through strategic action, and through the dignity I had carried silently for so long. That choice reinforced my strength, my self-worth, and my understanding of what it means to be treated fairly in a family. The echoes of those past moments, the misnaming, the mockery, the patience I exercised, will stay with me, but they no longer weigh me down. I carry the memory of my own perseverance, the clarity of my actions, and the knowledge that I can protect my dignity, even when others fail to recognize it. I have learned that self-respect is earned not only through how we treat ourselves, but also through how we assert our presence in spaces where we have been diminished. So now, I ask you, if someone laughed at your identity for years, dismissed your presence, or minimized your contributions, would you forgive, or would you take a moment, carefully and deliberately, to ensure they truly understand the weight of their words? I ask because the difference between being invisible and being recognized is not always in the actions of others, it is in how we choose to claim our voice, our dignity, and our self-worth. Subscribe now for more stories of family, respect, and standing your ground. Share below if you've ever made someone realize the weight of their words. Because sometimes, the quiet assertion of your truth is the strongest lesson anyone can ever learn.